They shot you with a revolver in your eye.
Yes. And that's
Is
it.
it a BB gun?
No, it was a real gun, man.
Shot in the eye with a revolver? Are you serious? Ryan scoffed, his voice laced with disbelief. This ain't no BB gun, kid, the officer replied gruffly. This was a real bullet. Ryan endures a grueling interrogation. Will he get the medical attention he desperately needs? Welcome to Cams Don't Lie. Let's dive in and discover the shocking truth behind Ryan's fight for survival. The situation was absurd. Here Ryan was, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the head, potentially facing death from a brain hemorrhage, yet the detectives treated him with suspicion. Eye shot? One mocked. You should be dead. Little did they know, Ryan wasn't fabricating. The nightmare began on December 23, 2006, when two vengeful men, Richie and Larry Carver, broke into Ryan's home. A past argument fueled their rage. Hearing a commotion at the door, Ryan approached cautiously. Suddenly, a hand shot through the opening, firing 2 rounds directly into his eye. Blinded and in excruciating pain, Ryan could only listen as the intruders entered and murdered his girlfriend, Heather. Miraculously, Ryan clung to life. Hours later, when the police finally arrived, he was barely coherent. Despite his obvious injuries, instead of medical attention, they took him to the station for a brutal interrogation, the longest hour of his young life. Before the grilling began, they left Ryan alone in the interrogation room. Handcuffed to the desk, he writhed in agony for 20 agonizing minutes, unable to call for help. The air in the interrogation room was thick with a tension as cold and heavy as Ryan's blood. Despite the obvious trauma etched on his face, the raw pain evident in every shallow breath, the detectives launched into their questions. Ryan, the lead detective began, his voice clipped and official. Do you know why you're down here? Ryan, his vision likely blurred and his head pounding, could only muster a weak, confused shake. You have no idea why I'm down here, he stammered, voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what happened. The detective sighed, a hint of impatience creeping into his tone.
Do something to make sure you understand your rights, okay? Basically, I'm going to read you. You've seen Cops before, right? Ever seen like a TV show Cops or CSI or anything like that?
Okay.
Ever seen that?
No.
You've never seen any kind of cop show? Lawyer show? Any kind of show?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, well, he said, shuffling papers. Let's make sure you understand your rights before we proceed. Have you ever seen one of those cop shows on TV, like CSI? Ryan's brow furrowed slightly. Had he seen such shows? The world spun a little, the harsh fluorescent lights blurring at the edges. Oh, okay, he mumbled, unsure. Ever seen anything like that? The detective pressed, a touch of condescension lacing his words. Ryan shook his head, a wave of nausea rising in his gut. No, he rasped, the effort of speaking seeming monumental. Lawyer's show? His voice trailed off, the question more of a confused murmur. The detective exchanged a look with his partner, a look that spoke volumes. All right, he said, a forced patience in his voice. Let me explain it to you then. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Ryan blinked, trying to focus on the words being thrown at him. Legal jargon swam in his head, meaningless against the backdrop of his throbbing skull. What's the highest grade I went through school? He slurred, the question nonsensical in the face of his situation. We can get back to that later, Ryan, the detective said curtly. Right now, I need you to focus. But focus was a distant concept for Ryan. His mind, clouded by pain and trauma, clung desperately to the single, desperate plea echoing in his thoughts. I just want to go home. A harsh laugh escaped the detective's lips. You're not going anywhere right now, Ryan.
What's the highest grade you went through school?
I don't know.
You don't know the highest grade you went through?
8?
8th grade? Did you graduate?
Yeah.
Now, let's try this again. What's the highest grade you completed? 8th? Did you graduate? Ryan's eyelids fluttered shut, the room tilting dangerously. The questions were relentless, a cruel counterpoint to the symphony of pain playing inside his head. "I don't know," he whispered, a tear tracing a silent path down his cheek. "I don't know. I don't read and write." His words hung in the air, a stark reminder of his vulnerability, a plea lost in the cold, calculating world of the interrogation room. Despite the growing evidence before him, the detective's approach took on a bizarrely patronizing tone. His voice, normally clipped and official, softened slightly, as if speaking to a disobedient child. He phrased his questions simply, enunciating each word with forced clarity. The sight before him, however, was a glaring contradiction to his approach. Ryan's face, marred by a swollen crimson welt, spoke volumes of the trauma he'd endured. His mumbled responses, a disjointed string of confusion and exhaustion, should have been a dead giveaway.
Do you have a girlfriend? No?
Yet the detective pressed on, seemingly blind to the obvious. "Did you have a girlfriend?" he began, the question elementary. Ryan, barely clinging to consciousness, managed a weak negative shake of his head. Undeterred, the detective continued, "You know a girl named Heather?" A faint hum of acknowledgement escaped Ryan's lips. "What's Heather's last name?" the detective pressed, his voice laced with a hint of suspicion that seemed misplaced under the circumstances. Ryan's response was a tangled mess of confusion. He struggled to understand, his words slurred and fragmented. "The one that lives there?" he mumbled, a question lost in his haze. "I know," the detective repeated, a touch of frustration creeping in. "I guess. I don't know." The exchange continued, a bizarre dance between a relentless questioner and a mind on the brink of collapse. Names, ages, details. The detective sought normalcy in a situation that screamed anything but.
What happened to your face?
I don't know.
You told the officer just a few minutes ago that someone hit you. Do you remember who hit you?
I don't know.
Finally, he landed on the most glaring anomaly, Ryan's injury. "All right," the detective said, exasperation tinging his voice. "What happened to your face?" Ryan, staring blankly ahead, offered a single, hollow response. "I don't know." It hung in the air, a testament to the detective's baffling obliviousness and Ryan's utter despair. The interrogation room transformed into a hall of mirrors, Ryan's fragmented memories reflecting a distorted reality. Just moments ago, he'd mumbled something about being hit. Now, the detective latched onto that detail, twisting it like a kaleidoscope. "You said someone hit you," the detective pressed, his voice sharp. "Do you remember who?" Ryan, lost in the labyrinth of his own mind, offered a tentative answer. "I think it was Heather." "Why would Heather hit you?" the detective demanded, suspicion replacing the earlier condescension. Confusion clouded Ryan's face. "That's an accident," he slurred, the words tumbling out with no clear context. "Accident? What was an accident?" The detective persisted, frustration edging into his tone. "Heather hitting me," Ryan mumbled, the memory flickering like a dying flame. "Where did she hit you with?" The detective probed further. "Her hand? Did you have an argument?" Ryan shook his head weakly. "Not really, no." "Not really?" the detective echoed, a skeptical "oh" escaping his lips. "What happened to make her hit you then?" Ryan's response was a jumbled mess. "She just hit me and I was saying it," he stammered. "She was giving Christina a head." His voice trailed off, the sentence dissolving into incomprehensible mumbling. "She was what?" The detective leaned forward, a frown creasing his brow. "She was having Christina with her hair or something," Ryan mumbled, his words slurred and fragmented. "I don't know. Who's Christina? Who's—" The detective sighed, a hint of exasperation in his voice. "Christina's on the couch, Ryan," he explained, a detail that would later prove irrelevant. Every question aimed at clarity only served to deepen the confusion. Ryan's muddled account, a clear sign of traumatic brain injury, flew right past the detective. The officer, focused on a narrative he couldn't grasp, failed to see the truth staring him in the face. The scene reached a fever pitch as the detective's final question hung heavy in the air. What happened last night? Ryan, swallowed by the fog in his head, could only offer a single, heartbreaking response. I don't know. The confusion in the room reached a suffocating level. Who's Christina? The detective pressed, exasperation coloring his voice. She's on the couch, Ryan mumbled, his words thick with fatigue and pain. The detective seized on this detail. Christina's on the couch, he repeated, a note of disbelief creeping in. This detail, while significant later, was irrelevant to the immediate situation. Here's the key point. We, the readers, know from the background information that Ryan and Heather lived with a third person, likely this Christina. However, the detective remains frustratingly oblivious. Ryan's muddled responses, a clear symptom of his head injury, only added to the chaos. Yeah, he slurred, the confirmation lacking conviction. Ryan, the detective began, his voice laced with frustration. It's astonishing that you can't remember anything. We just spoke about this. You said Christina was on the couch.
Who's Christina?
She's on the couch.
Christina's on the couch? What's Christina's last name?
I don't know.
What does she look like?
I really don't know.
I don't know, man, Ryan stammered, his voice laced with desperation. I really don't. The detective, fixated on a specific narrative, failed to see the bigger picture. Ryan's inability to recall details, the confusion around who was on the couch, all pointed towards a traumatic brain injury. Yet, the officer seemed determined to fit the pieces into a puzzle that didn't exist. Look, the detective pressed, his tone accusatory. You remember Heather hitting you in the eye, right?
I don't remember after that because I just went to lay down and go to sleep. I don't know what anybody was doing. I really don't.
Who was in the house when you went to sleep?
Christina and Heather.
Christina and Heather.
Ryan shook his head weakly. The question, nonsensical in the face of his obvious injury, only served to further disorient him. I don't know what anybody was doing, he mumbled, exhaustion evident in his voice. Who was in the house when you went to sleep? The detective persisted. Christina and Heather, Ryan mumbled, the names tumbling out in a jumbled mess. The detective seized on this, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. Christina and Heather. And Christina was on the couch? Heather was, Ryan mumbled, thoroughly lost in the back and forth. Heather was on the couch? The detective repeated, his voice sharp. You just told me Christina was on the couch a minute ago. Frustration and confusion warred on Ryan's face. I don't know, man, he pleaded. I really don't. I just want to go to sleep. Despite being in immense pain from his own gunshot wound, Ryan's account of the night was disjointed. He claimed Heather was shot in the face, but then said she was still and appeared to be sleeping. The detective pressed him, highlighting the inconsistencies in his story. Ryan insisted he was telling the truth, but couldn't explain why he wouldn't check on Heather after a gunshot, or why he would try to go back to sleep after being shot himself. Finally, Ryan admitted his attackers weren't strangers, but Heather's dad, though he offered no explanation for the shooting. Ryan and Heather are in their home when Heather's father arrives and shoots her. The dialogue continues with Ryan being questioned by the police about the events of the night. The detective finally acknowledges Ryan's potential physical injuries. He exits for an ambulance and returns seeking details about the shooting. Ryan denies Heather's connection to his attackers and remains clueless about their motive. 10 minutes later, the fire department, not paramedics, arrives to assess Ryan's condition. He convincingly feigns a serious head injury. The following section is unclear and seems disconnected from the previous events. The question is raised about paying for Ryan, but it's declined. They decide to take him somewhere, though the reason is unclear. The narrative becomes fragmented with repetitive phrases like "I don't know" and mentions of an unspecified event happening 9 times. There's confusion regarding who did what and the nature of the situation. Ryan expresses uncertainty about being shot, and the reason for the delay. The passage ends with the observation of a seemingly serious wound. Despite the grim observation about the bullet, Ryan endured another "I don't know" exchange. Finally, after a brutal 56-minute ordeal of interrogation, an ambulance arrived. At the hospital, the gravity of the situation became clear. Doctors confirmed Ryan had been shot in the eye and his condition was critical. The lack of timely care resulted in a preventable infection. Ryan's recovery was long and arduous. He spent 35 days in the hospital, losing part of his brain and his left eye. The trauma left a lasting mark. Seizures became a constant companion from the day he was discharged. Sadly, these seizures ultimately claimed his life in 2016. Justice, however, was served. Both Richie and Larry received life sentences without the possibility of parole.